So my name is Lauren Ellsworth. I'm here to talk to you about the effects and defects of defaults, particularly within Ruby and Python frameworks. This is me. You can find me on the internet as Red Yaffle pretty much everywhere. I'm a senior software engineer at Flatiron Health. Flatiron Health is an oncology data company, so we work to improve patient outcomes and accelerate cancer research. And I occasionally write things at these bottom two. Great, so the premise of this talk is that defaults make a difference. This is actually the last line of a paper linked down here called Do Defaults Save Lives by Eric Johnson and Daniel Goldsteins from 2003. And the paper is about organ donation. So in countries, many countries, all countries have organ donation, and some of them have presumed consent and some of them have explicit consent. So it hinges around this diagram. And if you look at Denmark and the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and Germany, you could think a lot of things about why they are not opting in to organ donation. And it might be religious, and it might be cultural. It might be because, I don't know, they hate all humans. Like, it could be any number of things. But actually, the difference between these two categories, which amounts to about a 60-point difference, is a checkbox. So our gold countries over here have a checkbox on like the DMV form. I know it's the DMV when you turn 16. Do you check this box? And the countries on the right, it's not a checkbox, but it's presumed that you consent to this unless you make an active effort to get out of it. Usually that effort is actually a lot of hurdles, phone calls, mailing in forms. It can be a multi-week process, which is why this is such a dramatic difference, or an element of why this is such a dramatic difference. But presumed consent and explicit consent have, a really massive distinction here. And so when we think about defaults with respect to engineering, actually the context of defaults that we're all talking about right now is only with respect to computers. Defaults in the context of a preset arose as an English word in the 60s with the rise of computing. Prior to that, you would default on a loan, you could be in default, but default preset is the absence of action in reference to computers and computing. And everything else that it's used for came from this. So when you think about it with reference to computing, like, somebody somewhere wrote these languages. We wrote the HTML, and we decided that if I write an input box and I make a checkbox and I don't put the word checked, it is presumed to be unchecked. It could just as well be the other way around. So we make these decisions when these languages are authored all the time. So in particular, I want to talk about Ruby and Python, frankly, because those are the two that I've worked the most with. And I want to talk about frameworks in Ruby and Python. At Flatiron Health, I work with our bootcamp team. So when we onboard a new engineer, we have about a 3-week time where we train them in a bunch of different classes how to interact with code at Flatiron. So it's really important that we take those 3 weeks to really set the tone and the standard for what we want them to pay attention to, how we want them to focus as an engineer at Flatiron. And actually, when you have a new engineer in any capacity, or you're switching languages or whatever else has happened, when you encounter a tutorial, you're kind of being told what to pay attention to. Right? So you're given this information, and it says note this and note that. You're really setting the stage for how people interact with the language out the gate. So in no particular order, let's take a look at these 4. And while we do so, consider that every policy must have a no action default. So everything that happens in a framework, if I do nothing, something will happen. Maybe that something is nothing, or maybe that something is, a really huge change that I need to undo. So every policy, every decision made has a no action default. Let's take a look at Flask first. So this is Flask's homepage. This actually is their tutorial. So put this in a file and run said file. It's fairly lightweight, and for the purposes of consistency, we'll go through all tutorials that interact with a database so we can actually see the effects of them. But if we run this tutorial as is, we get 5 lines, really simple, and we end up with a log that looks like this and a little hello world. So out the gate, we're already rolling 5 lines. It's great. And looking at this console, we see web requests, and we see timestamps, and we see the IP address, my local host that is accessing this console. So this is a application linked from the Flask documentation, which is a little bit more intensive, and it's a mini Twitter called mini twit. I don't know why it references to-do lists, but it does. And it's also very simple. So if we run through the commands for this, we get another 5 to get to our mini twit. We're actually just cloning this repo to try it out and see what it looks like. And we can run this. We will get a nice mini Twitter. I tweeted this morning. And a log that looks like this. So again, really consistent, right? We have web requests. We actually have our CSS, our style CSS in here. The fact that they're 200s, we get when there's redirects, when we post back. Really fast, very simple. This is what you should pay attention to when you're working with Flask. This is the configuration for the mini Twitter application. This is the only configuration they mention. They even comment it configuration. It's 4 lines. Where does the database live? How many things are on the page? Debug equals true, development key. I turned debug on and off. It made no difference in my console log. I'm going to be honest, I didn't go full in on what it meant for debug to be true. But for our mini Twitter application, it meant no change. That's Flask. Let's look at Django. Django has a much more thorough tutorial on their homepage. They have this Writing Your First Django App, Part 1. You get to these commands. So 6 in, we should have a site up and running. And it says in the documentation, you will now see a pleasant light blue box with the words, "It worked." And actually what you see is a security error. If anybody is a Django commenter, I would love help on actually reporting this back to the documentation. The documentation doesn't reference that the local host, both 0.0.0.0, localhost 127.0.0.1, none of them can access your local Django server. So I Googled it, obviously. I ended up on this Stack Overflow page, which is 4 months old and has 3,000 page views. So I don't think I was the only one who encountered this particular problem. It's a fairly easy solution. Edit the allowed hosts. Allow our local server access to it. So I did that. Here's my pleasant light blue box. Actually really funny to me is that Django always references get to work. So the tutorial says multiple times, like, now it's time to work. Now you can work smoothly. I heard that it was developed for a newsroom and that it was for like a rush job, and that's why it talks about work all the time. It like wants you to be really quick. It's like part of their founding origin story. I don't know if that's true. I just heard it. So 14 commands before we can get to a site that interacts with our database. There's a couple of interesting things in here. We're running a migration to make the migration and to add to our database. The application we're building for the Django tutorial is a polls application. So we're going to be polling people out the gate. And they have you run this create super user. Before you're running the full server, you are creating a super user. This is going to create about, because of this administrative capacity, for super users, there's about 10 tables behind the scenes that you didn't make. They just come with Django out of the box. And if we run this, we are instructed to get to the Django Administration area. So Django out of the box is coming with an entire infrastructure for managing users, managing groups, and managing the content that you're creating. You never get an option for that not to be true with your tutorial. Let's look at the console here. So it's a little different than what we're seeing with Flask. It's a slightly more robust. We get our Django version. We're actually missing our IPs. We no longer see which IPs are accessing our sites. We have timestamps. We don't have any CSS. We do have web requests. We also have this really nice feature that I really love, this performing system checks. System check identified no issues. We're getting reloads on the server. So when we change any page, we're automatically getting reloads posted here. Cool. We also get really nice failures with whitespace because we're still in the world of Python. This is the configuration for Django. It says in the configuration, quick start development settings, this is not intended for production, which I think makes it a little ironic that the emphasis is so hard on security. For development app with development configurations that doesn't want you to use it for production, the first 20, 30 lines of this file are all about security. So I get the message really quickly that with Django, the first thing I should be thinking through is security. Sinatra. Sinatra's tutorial is also on their homepage. It is a simple file. It says, put this in your pipe and smoke it. There's no tutorial linked from Sinatra, so I did a different one. This is the put it in your pipe and smoke it tutorial. This console is actually funny. Sinatra has taken the stage. Sinatra has ended his set. It's like kind of nice levity to it. But if I do a more thorough tutorial, which I found online, that involves a database connection, this is just making a really simple string app. So we have a table called models. You can see that I get database information for the first time. So my lines that have database information are different I have this D at the beginning. They're included. They say debug. And I get load times. I also get parameters interacting with the database. So the emphasis here, the visibility here, is into a component that Django nor Flask brought out. Cool. Last but not least, Rails. Rails has a really thorough tutorial, and I'm just going to state outright, I'm a big fan. Rails has a Rails guides, which we will go through. So 14 commands to get our blog up and running in the world of Rails. It's significantly less pretty than anything we've worked with yet. They don't really do anything with CSS or beautifying anything out the gate. You get this new article page where you can put in your blog post information. It redirects you to a show page where you can see the blog that you've just posted. And the console behind the scenes is the most robust yet. So when we launch, we have development information. We're running a Puma web server. We have our Rails version. We have our Ruby version, our Puma version, our threading, which environment we're running in, right? Out the gate, we have this holistic sense of like what is actually in play when we're running the server. We again see the database information. So schema migrations, which actually query on most, always query when the database starts. Transactions. We have timestamps both on databases and on page loads and render times. And in addition to that, we have the first insight into web request parameters. And it's not just the fact that we passed a title and we passed this body of the blog post. It's the fact that we're running UTF-8. It's the authenticity token coming from the front end and the commit message for the save. This is easily the most robust of these platforms, and the transparency into it. This is the Rails configuration file for development. Rails out of the box ships with 3, development, environment, and production. They all, by default, have debug level logging turned on. Rails has 6 levels of logging. Debug is the most verbose. It's actually the only one that includes database logging. And out of the box, development, production, and test all have debug enabled. The only one to expressly call it out in their config file is the production one. The development one doesn't even call out that it has this log level enabled. The other stuff we see in here is a lot of stuff about caching. It's a lot of stuff about when to fail in development versus production. We see some stuff about eager loading. Basically, this development file ends up saying, be nice to me, I'm developing. And the production file ends up saying, this is when the server should actually die. So a production server will not die if you don't have a migration yet, and a development server will die if you haven't run a migration. So there's this big difference between how they are out of the box defining the way you interact with development and the way you interact with production. It's also defaulting to a development production environment unless you specifically set an alternate parameter. So again, to look back at this log, when a new developer encounters their first web application of one of these 4 frameworks, and they're looking at this information of like what actually is happening, this is by far the most telling picture of what actually is happening. We're actually missing some other important stuff for a production log here. There's no timestamps on when I've made the page call. There are timestamps on when I'm inserting into the database. Those are actually coming from my web server, not from my database. So I can actually fake those if I wanted to. There are timestamps when I start out most of my database interactions, but if, say, something were to hang in there, I wouldn't see it. Also, because of the way the threading is all going to post to this one file, the transparency and those timestamps are going to kind of muddle in a way that the other ones wouldn't with the web requests. So that's the 4. If we go back to the original premise of defaults make a difference, we look at the 4 different frameworks and what they're proposing in each of their consoles. My argument here is that we train our developers. And so when we introduce them to a platform, when we welcome them into a new team, when we do whatever where they interact with us, we tell them what to care about. We tell them what to be sensitive to. And without some level of database sensitivity, when will they look into it? Like, when will we actually tell them, like, by the way, check your database? It's actually fairly hard to turn on database logging in a Flask application. I've had this personal experience. And I noticed that I had slowed down a web request fairly dramatically, a couple seconds to like a minute, to discover that I was making the same query on the page a dozen times because I wasn't passing the variable around correctly. But there's nothing in my console that would suggest that that's the case. There's nothing in my console that would warn me what interaction I had had. And so we introduce this complexity, we introduce this sort of hidden nature, and we emphasize what people should look at. So to go back to our original paper, in my 20 seconds, when you encounter a default or a preset in the sense of the word, you assume that somebody did it on purpose. For these frameworks, I don't actually know. If somebody did this on purpose or somebody didn't, somebody made a decision at some point, and whether that was intentional or not is an aside. But the majority will not change your defaults. This is true of donor donation, and it's true of our frameworks. And especially a new person will not change your defaults, because how are they going to know what to change it to? And so I think it's really important that we emphasize when we are working on these developments, when you are working with perhaps an older application, that we emphasize by putting into those logs what exactly people should be sensitive to, especially for the new people you are welcoming in. Thank you very much. Any questions? I could still do that, right? Yeah, questions? No? Yeah? That's a really good question. I messed around with trying to log database queries. I didn't actually try to log runtime information. Is anybody here a Django developer who knows the answer to that question? Can you log runtime in Django? I would assume that there's a way to do it. I don't know it offhand. I'd have to look it up. Yeah? What inspired this decision? Oh, I switched from a Rails stack to a Flask stack. And I actually didn't notice that my database logs were gone until I started really slowing down the web development. And then it occurred to me that a whole bunch of people who had never seen a Rails application had never seen that level of transparency. And they weren't sensitized to it in the way that I was. And I think that it was really the fact that I had been exposed to it in the past, the fact that I had been trained on that level of database sensitivity was actually really helpful for me, ultimately. And I think that we can learn a lot from our programming neighbors, as it were, but we don't often sort of cross those lines to see what those differences are. In the back?
Where do, I guess, sane defaults or show up work?
Sensible defaults? I think Postgres's logging defaults are really sensible out of the box. I think that most of the time you can at least get a feeling for whether the developers of the language or the tool or the whatever, whether or not they were thinking about this when they did it. And I actually think it's really ironic, right? Rails and Ruby are often painted as this magical language, everything that's happening is a secret. And Rails is by far the most transparent of these. And so I think you can tell when a platform has been sensitized to what they should be presenting and sort of dancing between too much and too little, which is also really an important threshold. I personally believe that with a beginner, it should be curated. It shouldn't be too much. I believe from my own work, digging through production logs, that there's almost never too much. And so I think that it's really good to think intentionally about what this might be and to change them, particularly because I know I don't usually change defaults myself unless something has gone horribly awry. And I think maybe we should all watch them with a closer eye. Any questions? No? Thank you.